Welcome to today's training on Prison Rape Elimination Act, otherwise known as PREA. At the conclusion of this course, you will be able to 1. Explain what the Prison Rape Elimination Act, PREA, is and to whom it applies. 2. Determine how PREA impacts your role. 3. Review and understand laws, mandatory reporting, PREA policies, and zero tolerance policies for sexual abuse and sexual harassment. 4. Examine the relationship between PREA and organizational culture to achieve a safe environment. 5. Understand sexual abuse and trauma. And 6. How to detect and respond to sexual abuse. PREA Overview. PREA. What is PREA? PREA is a Public Law 108-79 that was signed by President Bush September 4, 2003. PREA supports the elimination, reduction, and prevention of sexual assault within the corrections system. It mandates several national data collection activities. It created a national commission to develop standards and accountability measures for all correctional settings. PREA covers much more than prison rape. It covers a range of behaviors to include rape, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment. Additionally, on May 17, 2012, President Obama directed all agencies that are not subject to the Department of Justice's final rule to develop rules that comply with PREA. Keeping youth safe is everybody's business. Even if you don't work every day in a secure setting, you need to know what your responsibilities are regarding PREA. PREA may impact you in many different ways. A PREA incident may be reported to you, you may witness a PREA incident, or a youth on your caseload may be involved in a PREA incident. This training was developed to assist you in understanding your role related to PREA.
PREA doesn't just apply to prisons. It applies to all federal and state prisons, jails, police lockups, private facilities, and community correctional settings. Those include things such as residential, parole, halfway houses, and etc. It also includes immigration detention centers, U.S. Armed Forces detention centers, tribal confinement centers, and for DCS, it includes any juvenile facility in the state that houses 50% or more juvenile justice youth. That means dependent neglect and unruly youth could fall under PREA standards due to their placement. All employees, volunteers, contractors, and others who may have access to youth placed in juvenile facilities need to have a clear understanding that any type of sexual relationship with a youth under DCS supervision will not be tolerated. Furthermore, knowledge of any such occurrence or claimed occurrence must be reported immediately and appropriately. There are three main reasons why PREA was enacted. The first is public safety, because those who experienced brutality and assault while in confinement were more likely to commit crimes when released. The second is because of public health, because prison rape increases the incidence and spread of sexually transmitted diseases, HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis. And thirdly, due to institutional violence. Institutional violence increases mental health care expenditures, the rate of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, suicide, homicide, and violence. PREA promotes best practice standards regarding safety and security. For example, standards give direction to staffing patterns, classification, supervision, investigations, policy, first responder protocol, training, zero tolerance, and overall promotes a culture of safety within the agency and facilities. DCS has a written policy mandating zero tolerance towards all forms of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. This outlines the agency's approach to preventing, detecting, and responding to such conduct. That policy, policy number 18.8, is included in this training material. All employees show acknowledgement and notification of the Prison Rape Elimination Act on Form 0940. The success of the PREA standards in combating sexual abuse in confinement facilities depends on the effective agency and facility leadership and the development of an agency culture that prioritizes efforts to combat sexual abuse. Leadership has done many things to promote this safety culture, including policies, protocols, and training. I'm sure you can think of many others. We just learned that the role of leadership is important to agency culture. However, what role can you play in safety related to PREA? There are many things that you can do to promote the safety culture. First, you can adhere to facility, agency, zero tolerance policy. You can take note of any vulnerabilities within buildings. Maintain respectful communication among staff and youth. Accept reports from youth respectfully. Take all reports seriously. Hold yourself and coworkers accountable by promoting a safe environment. You can also use respectful language, use good practices, and of course, use professionalism in all interactions. Rights related to PREA. Pursuant to Tennessee Code Annotated 37-1-403 and 37-1-605, any person who has reasonable cause to believe that a child is being sexually abused, sexually assaulted, or sexually harassed has the duty to report such abuse immediately. Everyone in Tennessee is a mandated reporter. All allegations of sexual abuse are reported to the DCS hotline or online at the secure site. The reporter may remain anonymous. Failure to comply with duty to report requirements results in disciplinary action up to and including termination and/or criminal charges. Failure to report abuse is a violation of the law and a Class A misdemeanor, carrying a sentence of up to 3 months imprisonment, a fine, or both. Those who report and act in good faith are immune from any civil or criminal charges which may result. Youth are informed of their rights related to PREA during intake activities at the facility. They are also assessed for victimization. This assessment is documented on a form. That form is then sent to the parent and FSW. The FSW shall review the form and place it in the case file. Planning for safety is individualized based upon the assessment. Youth acknowledge being informed of PREA on Form CS 0939. In relation to PREA, youth and juvenile facilities must have reasonable and confidential access to their attorneys, any other legal representatives, including John L. attorneys, parents and/or other legal guardians. Defining terms. On the following slides, we will discuss the following key terms: sexual abuse, sexual harassment, reporting, retaliation, and the code of silence. Statistics regarding sexual abuse report that 1 in 6 boys experience some form of sexual abuse before they turn 18, and 1 in 4 girls experience some form of sexual abuse before they turn 18. Sexual abuse is defined as actual, attempted, coerced, threatened, or requested sexual contact, penetration of the anal or genital opening of another person, however slight, by a hand, finger, object, or instrument, any other intentional touching, any attempt, threat, or request to engage in sexual activities, any display by a staff member, contractor, or volunteer of his or her uncovered genitalia, buttocks, or breast in the presence of a youth, voyeurism by a staff member, contractor, or volunteer. By law, youth cannot consent while in a confinement setting to staff, volunteers, or contractors. Any sexual activity between staff and youth is considered a violation of PREA and zero tolerance policy. This is a violation because of the imbalance of power that exists in confinement settings. Due to their status, youth-on-youth sexual contact is not considered consensual. Sexual abuse in juvenile facilities can be perpetrated by other youth, staff, contractors, volunteers, and others who have access to youth in care. Sexual harassment includes repeated and unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or verbal comments, gestures, or actions of a derogatory or offensive sexual nature by one youth directed towards another. Repeated verbal comments or gestures of a sexual nature to a youth by a staff member, contractor, or volunteer, including demeaning references to gender, sexually suggestive or derogatory comments about body or clothing, or obscene language or gestures. There are significant consequences if staff do not respect the rights of youth to be free from sexual abuse and harassment, as well as staff and youth's rights to be free from retaliation for reporting. Those consequences include a generally unsafe environment, physical or psychological damage to youth and or staff, distrust of authority, re-traumatization, physical health concerns, increased vulnerability to future abuse, constitutional violations, violations of state law, violations of agency policy, and diminished credibility of the juvenile justice and child welfare profession. Retaliation occurs when a youth or staff injures, harms, or intimidates a person who has reported sexual abuse and or sexual harassment or attempts to do so in response to the report. The facility and agency shall protect youth and staff who report sexual abuse, harassment, or cooperate with an investigation from retaliation. Retaliation could look like many things. It could look like veiled threats, shunning from a group, sudden change in demeanor, slashing of car tires, verbal or emotional abuse, or physical assault. For at least 90 days following a report, the agency monitors the conduct and treatment of staff and youth. Items to monitor include disciplinary reports, housing or program changes, negative performance reviews, reassignments, and status checks. Obligation to monitor shall terminate if the agency determines the allegation is unfounded. The Code of Silence is an informal institutional or organizational culture that says members of the group will not inform on or give evidence or testimony against other members of the group, even though actions of the other members may involve breaches of policy or even the criminal law. The following are evident in a culture of reporting safety. Staff and youth are willing to report suspected sexual abuse and harassment. Staff and youth have a high degree of trust in the investigative process and in administrative follow-up. Communication and interactions are generally respectful and professional, both between staff and from staff to youth. Staff and youth know how to report and know the steps in the investigative process. Staff and youth are confident there will be no retaliation for reporting. And finally, data from grievances, incident reports, and disciplinary reports is collected and reviewed by leadership, and trends in reporting are identified. Let's do some self-reflection. Let's answer these questions. What happens to those who report misconduct in my agency? What happens to those who do not report and should? What characteristics at my workplace support reporting? What characteristics at my workplace may be a barrier to reporting? Signs and symptoms. Consider how sexual abuse dynamics in juvenile facilities might differ compared to the community. In juvenile facilities, there are environmental differences, reporting challenges, vulnerable populations, reasons that the abuse occurred, gender differences, imbalance of power, and the investigative process.
This slide illustrates data from a National Bureau of Justice Statistics study. The study was designed to encourage a fuller reporting of victimization. The reason victims did not report are as listed. 69% felt embarrassed or ashamed, 70% didn't want anyone to know, 43% thought staff would not investigate, 41% were afraid of being punished, and 52% were afraid of the perpetrator. In the free world, 60% of sexual abuse victims do not report. Think about your population within juvenile facilities and their relationship with staff. Do you think that they are just as likely to report as people in the free world? Thinking of your answer, if you believe that they are just as likely to report, that means that we are assuming 60% of sexual abuse incidents are not reported.
Signs and symptoms of sexual abuse are difficult to track, but there are some potential signs. Remember, every victim responds differently. We will address potential physical and psychological signs of abuse on the next slides. Some potential physical signs of sexual abuse include sexually transmitted infections, unexplained pregnancies, stomach or abdominal pain, difficulty in walking and sitting, and unexplained injuries. Some potential psychological signs of sexual abuse include acting out, anger, anxiety, depression, disbelief, difficulty concentrating, suicidal thoughts, and numbness. Some common responses of male victims include aggressive and destructive behavior, feelings associated with victimization, including shame and stigma, questioning sexual identity and preference. They may feel the best defense is a good offense. They may imitate their aggressors and are acutely aware of their ranking within the juvenile facility. Some common responses of female victims include being at risk for unhealthy relationships with authority figures, difficulty adjusting to coercive, restrictive environments, trauma responses due to lack of privacy, room or dorm searches, bodily searches. Those things may replicate past abuse, concern with how reporting may interrupt relationships, and they also may question their sexual identity or preference. The following list shows indicators of sexual victimization. Those indicators include isolation, depression, lashing out at others, refusing to shower, suicidal thoughts or actions, seeking protective custody, refusing to leave their room, increase in misconduct, increase in sexualized language and conversations, changes in relationships with other youth, unusually aggressive, or lingering near staff. The following is a list of indicators of victims of youth-on-youth sexual abuse. Those indicators include letters between residents, graffiti, bedwetting, exchanging food, sharing food, using food for favors, or giving away commissary items, afraid to shower, drama, fighting, and homicidal threats. The following is a list of indicators of youth who display abusive behaviors. Those behaviors include stalking or grooming, trading of favors, hard bragging, access to extra commissary, referred to in correspondence, voyeurism, history of victimization or assault, verbal harassment, wanting a two-person room, history of frequent room changes, sudden changes in behavior among younger or more vulnerable youth, frequently testing boundaries, history of refusing searches, and someone who has lookouts. This visual represents the continuum of staff sexual misconduct that is based on research in juvenile and adult facilities. The continuum begins with sexual innuendo, moves on to sexually explicit requests, then to sexual gestures and voyeurism, inappropriate searches, inappropriate touching, sexual intercourse and oral sex, and rape. Trauma is the experience of violence and victimization, including sexual abuse. Trauma impacts each individual differently. When trauma occurs, human stress response hormones are released. Those hormones are released to help us respond to that trauma. That means two things are happening. A signal shoots to the brain, and then the fight or flight body response occurs, or tonic immobility can occur, where the body literally freezes. The other thing to remember is that the stress hormone interferes with the way that we are able to store memory. Victims may not remember the incident or have altered memory regarding the incident. The impact of continuous trauma is real. The trauma response, or PTSD, is continuing to live in the brain. If we are constantly in fear of abuse or retaliation, the brain begins to become hardwired to respond immediately. This can create chronic hyperarousal. The brain then has the inability to calm down, creating a lot of anxiety, difficulty sleeping, irritability, and impulsive behaviors. Potential responses to victimization. Victims of sexual abuse are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression, 6 times more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 26 times more likely to abuse drugs, and 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide. Prevention and detection. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 9.5% of adjudicated youth in state and state-contracted facilities reported experiencing one or more incidents of sexual victimization. 2.5% reported youth-on-youth incidents, while 7.7% reported staff-on-youth incidents. The following is a list of people who are at greater risk of victimization. That list includes people who identify as LGBTQI, people who are younger and are smaller, people with disabilities, people who are biracial or multiracial, and people who have been victims of previous sexual abuse. Remember to be vigilant and equitable to ensure the safety of the most vulnerable. Prevention strategies for staff. Enforce the policy on zero tolerance. Support the sexual abuse reporting policy. If you see something, say something. Pay attention to your surroundings. Look for blind spots, unlock doors, and remember to be aware of any staffing shortages. And lastly, ask the youth about their safety. As an agency, the department has implemented many prevention strategies. Those prevention strategies include the PREA and zero tolerance policy, technology such as cameras, updated search procedures. They've hired a statewide PREA coordinator and PREA compliance manager. There's visual information such as posters, handbooks, and DVDs. We have youth education, placement, and supervision at the facilities based off of the PREA standards. The intake screening includes questions on PREA and makes an assessment on victimization. There's training for staff, as well as monitoring through audits and data collection. Detection strategies for staff. Take note of behaviors and patterns. Address the youth should their behavior become uncharacteristic or the youth demonstrate signs and symptoms of victimization. Take note of staff behaviors should they become uncharacteristic. And of course, refer to red flags to help guide detection. As an agency, the department has implemented many detection strategies. Some of those include youth reporting, access to the hotline, disciplinary action, staff reporting, PREA investigations, annual survey of sexual violence, coordinated response, first responder protocol, red flags, medical services, the grievance process, and victim services. Response and reporting. You may play a role as part of a coordinated response to an allegation of sexual abuse or sexual harassment. You may receive information on the allegation, be a first responder, part of medical, part of leadership or supervision, mental health, investigator, or assist the victim and serve as an advocate. Youth may report incidents multiple ways. They may report through the hotline at 877-237-0004 or online. They can report through a grievance. They can report to staff. They can report to victim services or community rape crisis centers. They can report to the PREA coordinator or compliance manager. They can report to family members, volunteers, FSWs, and attorneys. Staff must take reports verbally, in writing, anonymously, or from third parties, documenting any verbal reports promptly. Staff can report an incident or allegation of sexual abuse to the following: the DCS Child Abuse Hotline at 1-877-237-0004 or online. Remember, you are a mandated reporter and you may choose to remain anonymous when reporting. Staff reporting duties. Staff are to report immediately and according to agency policy any knowledge, suspicion, or information regarding an incident of sexual abuse or sexual harassment that occurred in a facility. This includes any retaliation against youth or staff who reported the incident, any staff neglect or violation of responsibilities that may have contributed to an incident or retaliation. Staff should not reveal any information related to a sexual abuse report to anyone other than to the extent necessary as specified in agency policy to make treatment, investigation, and other security and management decisions. Allegations can be made against another youth, staff, volunteers, contractors, or others who have access to the youth. Who is a first responder? Anyone can be a first responder in terms of being the first to know information or come upon an incident. Upon learning of an allegation that a youth was sexually abused, the first staff member to respond to the report is required to take several immediate steps. It is very important that you know your policy and responsibilities related to first responder duties. First Responder Protocol. Click on the link to learn about the First Responder Protocol that is attached to Policy 18.8. First responders should not conduct in-depth interviews or attempt to determine anything beyond the basic information listed on the previous slide. Attempt to determine the validity of an allegation. Play any role in deciding whether an allegation should be reported to investigators. Destroy or disturb any evidence, or make conclusions in the report. First responders know that interactions with the victim could positively or negatively impact the investigation. Interactions with the victim should be culturally and developmentally appropriate and gender specific. Treat all victims with dignity and respect. Refer to what was learned about the dynamics of sexual abuse and harassment in confinement. Explain the importance of maintaining physical evidence. Encourage the victim not to do anything that could contaminate evidence, such as showering, eating, or drinking. Encourage involvement with mental health professionals. Allow the victim to have an advocate present. Explain the investigation process. Remember, discussing sex may be culturally prohibited. Youth may not have the appropriate language to use when discussing the incident. Boundaries. Some behaviors that can put you at risk of crossing professional boundaries include making sexual jokes with youth or in front of youth, using nicknames instead of proper terminology, discussing personal issues with youth or in front of youth, allowing a favorite youth to have special privileges, feeling like you can trust a youth to have your back, doing special favors for youth, getting involved with youth issues, gossiping about other staff with youth or in front of youth, complaining about supervisors or your job with youth. Messages to staff. What is expected? No personal dealings. Be compassionate. Avoid sexualized environment. Be respectful. Report suspicious behaviors. And be trauma-informed. Boundaries. What can you do? Observe and learn the patterns and behaviors of the youth you supervise to better prevent, detect, and respond to sexual abuse. Be approachable and respectful by using professional communication. Remember your role with youth and refer them to the appropriate staff, and follow policy. Professionalism compromised. Inappropriate staff-youth relationships jeopardize security, victimize or re-traumatize those vulnerable from past abuse, damage trust among staff, youth, families, volunteers, and contractors, violate constitutionally guaranteed rights of the youth, create a hostile, sexualized work environment, expose the entire agency and staff to civil and criminal liability, polarize the department as people take sides, create bad press and media, and undermine public support for corrections, child welfare, and for state and local government. Safety compromised. Inappropriate staff-youth relationships result in contraband being brought into the facility, create an opportunity for youth to access restricted areas, can provide youth with access to information on security and operations, put the staff in a precarious situation beholden to youth requests for fear of being found out, creates distrust with coworkers. Who will have your back? Staff stop thinking clearly about safety and security and are focused on the relationship. Culture compromised. Inappropriate staff-youth relationships create a sexualized work environment, create a culture of secrecy and the code of silence, create a culture of accepting inappropriate behaviors, make staff uncomfortable to go to work, can result in unwanted media attention, lawsuits, investigations, and damages lives of the staff, victims, and families. Self-assessment. Number 1. Do you look forward to seeing a particular youth when you come to work? 2. Have you done anything with a youth that you would not want your family or your supervisor to know about? 3. Would you be reluctant to have a coworker observe your behavior for an entire day? 4. Do you talk about your personal matters with youth? 5. Do you believe you can ask a youth to do personal favors for you? 6. Have you ever received personal advice from a youth? 7. Have you said anything to a youth that you would not want recorded? 8. Do you have thoughts or fantasies of touching a particular youth? Does this extend to planning how you can be alone with that youth? 9. Do you think you have the right to touch a youth whenever and wherever you want to? 10. Do you look forward to sharing good or bad news with a particular youth? 11. Do you think youth are not allowed to say no to you, no matter what you ask? And 12. Have you ever allowed a youth to talk to you about sexual experiences or sexual fantasies or sexual jokes? Have you ever shared these things with a youth? Danger zone. If you answered yes to any of the preceding questions, you may be in danger. Sexual misconduct often begins as overfamiliarity with a youth. Even offering something you may think is simple and harmless, such as candy or soda, can begin to break down professional boundaries. Strategies to avoid inappropriate relationships are found on the next slide. Strategies to avoid inappropriate relationships. Follow policy. Behave ethically. Do not share personal information. Do not socialize. Do not give legal advice. Do not grant special favors. Do not give or accept gifts. Do not gamble or make bets. Have a mentor or coworker to talk to if you feel vulnerable. False allegations can occur. False allegations can be personally and professionally challenging. Investigations are critical even in false allegations. It maintains credibility of the system and can clear your name. Do not spread rumors or gossip about the person in question. Educate youth on the damage false allegations can create on personal lives, the facility, and their own lives should something serious need to be reported. Strategies to avoid false allegations. For anyone working with youth, you may face a false allegation against you. What can you do? Maintain respectful and professional communication at all times. Clearly establish your professional boundaries with staff and youth. Create credibility among youth and staff through being fair and policy-minded. Communication. The words we use are powerful. The language staff uses helps to create a culture of safety and respect. If staff use disrespectful, offensive, or abusive language, it creates an environment that condones the same behavior from the youth. Use professional and culturally appropriate language as opposed to slang or slurs. Consider that everyone does not identify as heterosexual or as gender conforming. Be aware of how your own beliefs affect your perceptions and how words you may use on the job could be offensive to others. Nonverbal communication. Language can be verbal and nonverbal. Over 70% of our communication is nonverbal. Nonverbal communication can include gestures, laughing, facial expressions, body language, snickering, ignoring, rolling eyes, or imitating. Effective communication is an important skill that will help you in your job to keep staff and youth safe. It combines a set of skills including nonverbal communication, attentive listening, the ability to manage stress in the moment, and the capacity to recognize and understand your own emotions and those of the person with whom you are communicating. Throughout this course, you learn skills to create an agency culture of safety and respect. That includes sexual safety. You have reached the conclusion of the presentation portion of this course.